Female reproductive cycles are initiated at puberty, usually between the ages of 10 and 14. Each reproductive cycle, which averages 28 days, consists of a sequence of changes that occur in the ovaries and uterus. During each reproductive cycle, gonadotropin-releasing hormone, or GnRH, from the hypothalamus stimulates the anterior pituitary to release two gonadotropic hormones, follicle-stimulating hormone, or FSH, and luteinizing hormone, or LH. The target organ for these two hormones is the ovary. Each female reproductive cycle has two components, the ovarian cycle and the uterine cycle. Ovulation occurs on day 14 of the 28-day ovarian cycle. The 14 days prior to ovulation are known as the follicular phase, while the 14 days following ovulation constitute the luteal phase. The ovarian cycle is regulated by changing levels of FSH and LH. Ovulation occurs on day 14 of the 28-day uterine cycle. The 14 days prior to ovulation are subdivided into a menstrual phase, days 1 to 5, and a proliferative phase, days 6 to 14. The 14 days after ovulation constitute the secretory phase. The uterine cycle is controlled by the ovarian hormones, estrogen and progesterone. The events in the ovary prior to ovulation constitute the follicular phase of the ovarian cycle. In the first 5 days, increased GnRH stimulates the anterior pituitary to increase production of FSH and LH. This stimulates primordial follicles in the ovary to mature into primary follicles, each containing a diploid primary oocyte that is arrested in prophase 1 of meiosis I. At the same time in the uterine cycle, decreasing levels of progesterone lead to sloughing or shedding of the endometrial lining. This is the menstrual phase, commonly referred to as a woman's period. In the ovary during the second part of the follicular phase, days 6 to 13, a small number of primary follicles form secondary follicles. About 2 days before ovulation, under the influence of increasing levels of LH and FSH, the follicle expands to form a swelling on the surface of the ovary. Approximately 16 hours before ovulation, the levels of FSH and LH surge to cause the final maturation of the follicle, now called a mature or Graafian follicle. Just prior to ovulation, the primary oocyte completes meiosis I to form a haploid secondary oocyte. Simultaneously, the lining of the endometrium begins to reform under the influence of estrogen produced by the ovarian follicular cells. This is known as the proliferative phase of the uterine cycle. As the level of LH peaks, proteolytic enzymes produced in the follicle cause its wall to weaken and rupture. Ovulation is the release of the secondary oocyte from the mature follicle. After ovulation, the ovary enters the luteal phase of the ovarian cycle, days 15 to 28. During this period, the remaining ovarian follicular cells form a corpus luteum, which produces the hormones progesterone and estrogen. Progesterone and estrogen from the corpus luteum stimulate further thickening of the endometrium in the secretory phase of the uterine cycle, days 15 to 28. If fertilization and implantation occur, cells at the implantation site in the uterus begin to produce human chorionic gonadotropin, or HCG. HCG prevents degeneration of the corpus luteum, so that elevated progesterone and estrogen levels are maintained to prevent shedding of the uterine lining at the end of the uterine cycle. After 8 to 12 weeks, the corpus luteum ceases to produce progesterone and estrogen and degenerates to become the corpus albicans. The placenta in the uterus replaces the corpus luteum in producing progesterone and estrogen. If fertilization does not occur, the corpus luteum becomes a corpus albicans by the end of the cycle. This leads to decreased levels of progesterone and estrogen and results in menstruation and the beginning of the next uterine cycle.